All right, guys, time to learn some economics. Hope you're having a good day so far. In this lecture, we are going to talk about. We're going to go through both Module 35 and 37. We're going to explain why classical macroeconomics wasn't adequate for the problems posed by the Great Depression. Talk about how Keynes came up with macroeconomic policy. Talk about other different types of economic schools of thought there. Classical macroeconomics asserted that monetary policy affected only the aggregate price level, not aggregate output. All right. They asserted that the short run was unimportant, so they were not worried about anything going on in the short run. They were more concerned about the long run implications of whatever it was they were doing. So according to that model, prices are flexible, making the aggregate supply curve vertical even in the short run, which I'll show in a second. As a result, an increase in the money supply leads other things equal to an equal proportional rise in the price level with no effect on GDP. No, we've talked about in this class how that is not correct, right? We talked about Keynesian economics and all that stuff. So just make sure that you when I show the graphs, you understand that this was the school of thought beforehand, right? You think classical, you think old, right? This was before Keynesian came about to show why this was wrong. So by the 1930s, the measurement of the business cycles was a well-established subject, but there was no accepted theory of business cycles. What that means is they were tracking what was going on with unemployment, with inflation, with other things, but they were not as concerned with what was happening as a whole, right? They just didn't have as much data as they have today. They didn't have as much history of studying the economy to be able to look back and say, oh, hey, during this period, this stuff was happening. This is what could have been done to fix it. Now we have the benefit of hindsight to look back and say, okay, these things should have happened, and that's why the recession of 2008 wasn't as bad as the depression in the 30s. All right. By 1936, John Maynard Keynes presented his analysis in his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. Snooze fest. Don't worry about reading it. Just worry about learning the important lessons that were in it. The school of thought that emerged out of the works of John Maynard Keynes is known as Keynesian economics. Essentially, he reflected two big innovations. First of all, that short-run effects of shifts in the aggregate demand on aggregate output, basically meaning that when aggregate demand increases, that will cause real GDP to actually increase. Okay, so there is a short-run impact in changing aggregate demand. The long run, yes, it's important, but in the long run, we're all dead, was his saying. Okay, so he was also concerned with the short run. Keynes also argued that other factors than money are mainly responsible for business cycles, things like consumer spending, investment spending. All those things were super important to helping the economy, and so he focused on getting those things improved. Here is the different aggregate demand, aggregate supply graphs that, to show you the difference here. So as you can see in the classical view, the short and aggregate supply curve is vertical. So if aggregate demand decreased, all that impact was price level. That did not have any impact on real GDP. However, we know that in the short run, that does have a major impact on GDP because people are buying less stuff, and that has that negative multiplier effect. So that's what Keynes proved by having his upward sloping aggregate supply curve, not just vertical. All right. The main practical consequence of Keynes' work was that it legitimized macroeconomic policy activism, which is the use of monetary and fiscal policy to smooth out the business cycle. About half of this class is focused on this macroeconomic policy activism, on stabilization policies, right, using expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy during certain economic circumstances, and doing expansionary or contractionary monetary policy during certain economic circumstances. Right. As you can see during this chart here, this proves a little bit what Keynes was saying about how if governments increase budget deficit spending during periods of depression or recession, then that can lower the unemployment rate. And then once that's over, if we cut our deficits, right, we can make our money back and pay off debt. All right. Monetarism asserted that GDP will grow steadily if the money supply grows steadily. It called for a shift from monetary policy rule to that of discretionary monetary policy. Monetarism came out as a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Counter to Keynesian economics. It was sort of to kind of bring it back to a more traditional sense of just focusing on the money supply. It argued that GDP would grow steadily if the money supply grew steadily, which does happen a little bit because if money supply grows, that lowers interest rates, that increases investment and consumer spending, and that causes people to go out and buy stuff, and that causes aggregate demand to increase, and so on and so forth. Monetarism was influential for a time, but it was eventually rejected by many macroeconomists, except for the fact of doing discretionary monetary policy. That's kind of the big thing that sticks here, meaning the Federal Reserve actually looks at what's going on with the economy and then supplying a appropriate monetary policy to correct it. Remember that. Monetarism, when the central bank changes interest rates or the money supply based on its assessment of the state of the economy, it's engaged in discretionary monetary policy. Now, the other term you need to know is the velocity of money. The velocity of money is the ratio of nominal GDP to the money supply. The velocity of money equation is the money supply M times the velocity is equal to the price level times GDP. So if you wanted to solve for the velocity, you would simply divide by the money supply, you take the money supply, divide that out algebraically by the price level and times real GDP. You would get the velocity. And all the velocity means is how quickly a dollar moves through the economy. All right, so if people are out there spending more money, more actual cash, velocity increases. If people are spending less money, velocity is going to decrease. Monetarists believe that velocity was stable. So they believe that the Federal Reserve kept M on a steady growth path. Nominal GDP would also grow. The problem is that velocity isn't exactly stable. It can increase or decrease. So that's where that breaks down. We're going to skip over that because we talked a lot about that. The political business cycle is when politicians use macroeconomic policy to serve political ends rather than using it to correct what's going on in the economy. All right, politicians are political. They're going to try and do things that actually help out with the economy. Or not with the economy, with their political standing. That's why it's politically very difficult to raise taxes, because people don't want to raise taxes, because that means they're not going to get reelected. No one's ever won saying across the board, we're going to raise your taxes, it's going to pay off the debt. It's such a boring thing to raise taxes for. No one's going to do that. Instead, they're going to cut taxes, increase spending, and not worry about how to pay for it. All right? Rational expectations, last thing, is the view that individuals and firms make decisions optimally using all available information. Now, that is usually true, but it is definitely not always true. All right? Think about people who would rather spend a bunch of money on a certain brand of clothing because it's a certain brand of clothing, rather than just going and getting the regular stuff for cheap at a different store, right? Doesn't make sense, but people do it all the time. But usually people are rational, and they'll look at things and make a rational decision when it comes to how to spend money. Okay, so that's Module 35. Now time to go to Module 37. All right. Okay, so in this module, we're going to talk about long-run GDP growth. The key statistic used to track economic growth is real GDP per capita in a lot of cases. It's not a perfect measurement, all right, but remember, real GDP per capita is simply taking the real GDP number and dividing it up by the population. Again, not perfect, because you have certain oil-rich countries like Qatar that have an incredibly high GDP per capita, but doesn't necessarily mean that their economy is perfect or doing absolutely stellar. It just means they have a lot of oil money coming in and not a high population. All right. So comparing economies across time and space, real GDP per capita, again, if you reduce it down to what it would be in certain dollar amounts, we can see that the United States real GDP per capita has had certain periods of fluctuations, but overall, trend line wise, we have been steadily growing. China is on a much more rapid ascent. India is also on a fairly rapid ascent. We've been a pretty slow and steady growth rate. So that's why people are saying China will eclipse us in terms of real GDP within a given very, very soon. So let's see, U.S. real GDP per capita percentage. Okay, income around the world. So if we're to compare our income to other countries' income around the world, we can see we are generally in a pretty high income area in areas. You see a lot of oil-rich countries here. I'm not sure that would be the case anymore, but currently is. United States, Mexico, most of Europe, Russia, right? Lots of oil-rich countries have high incomes according to GDP per capita. Several countries have it because they have a very diverse economy where people are making a lot of money. In our case, in Western European countries, other cases not so much. All right. Growth rates. Long-run economic growth is normally a gradual process in which real GDP per capita grows at most a few percent a year. From 1910 to 2010, real GDP averaged 2.1% growth per year. Slow and steady wins the race. You don't want to get too hot because then that causes really high inflation. You don't want things to go backwards because then your economy's not growing. So about 2% a year multiplied out over 100 years ends up being a lot of growth. All right, so the U.S. economy is much, much larger than it was then just by growing a little bit at a time. We'll talk about this more in class, the rule of 70. Average annual growth rates, as we can see, China, India, Ireland was up there. This was in 2013. I'm not sure how much all this would hold anymore. So let's see. We'll skip over that. Okay, here are the sources of long-run growth. All right, the first big one is labor productivity, often referred to simply as productivity. This is basically how much each person, each worker can make. All right, so if you're in an economy where each person can be super efficient, has lots of technology at their disposal, you're going to be able to make a lot more stuff than in a country where everyone's just still doing stuff by hand, trying to make things, right? So having good productivity for your labor is super important for long-run growth. The next important thing is physical capital. This consists of human-made resources such as buildings and machines. We also might see it listed as plants and equipment in certain questions. Okay, having more physical capital is very, very important for economies because without that, people are going to be there left making stuff by hand. They're not going to have access to technology, robots, buildings to work in, state-of-the-art facilities, right? All of that consists of physical capital. The next super important thing for long-run growth is having human capital. This is the improvement in labor created by education and the knowledge embodied in the workforce. So part of you guys going to school and being educated up to a certain point, K through 12, is to improve on the human capital we have in our economy. Right? Human capital is a lot more monetarily intensive than physical capital, and it's more difficult to track and to know when you've reached certain levels of success. Like if you have a robot that can make 5,000 cars in a year, that's a very measurable thing. With educating kids, that is an incredibly difficult thing to measure, but we kind of know, okay, having an educated workforce is really good for the economy. So we're going to do it. All right. Next up is technology. That's the technical means for production of goods and services. So things like the internet, supply chain management, RFID chips, right? All these things, robots, fall within the technology side of things. So it's very important for these things to happen. Now, we're going to graph in here, and in fact on your papers and in your notebooks, long-run growth and production possibility curve is shown with a rightward shift of the production possibility curve. So go ahead and draw yourself one of those. Long-run growth in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph is shown by a rightward shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve. So if any of these things change, then that's what's going to cause an increase in the production possibility curve or an increase in the long-run aggregate supply. Other than that, it's going to be short-run fluctuations. But these are the things that lead to true, huge, long-run economic growth. That's all I got for you guys. Hope you have a good rest of your day.